Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope so. So welcome to the 2018 OE webinar series. Today we are listening to Kara Sappington talk to us about the dimensions of culture and influences in higher education. So we'll start out with that. Before we get started and I hand it over to Kara, I wanted to give you a little spiel about what's going on with OE education. So my name is Cherise Bunn, and I'm the Director of Education for Oregon Women in Higher Education. And I work on some different OE initiatives, including this webinar series and these other things coming out. So you have an opportunity as an OE member or as a participant to propose a webinar or listen to a webinar. So all these webinars are free, and OE members actually offer their time and knowledge to the community. So there is an opportunity for you to propose something if you're interested in that. You can write for OE. So there is a forum online where you can submit a proposal to write for the OE blog. Also, if you haven't done so yet, even before you write for the OE blog, please read the blog. We have pretty much twice a month folks contribute to the blog and give us some really great content. Along with that, we have the OE Book Club, which is mainly on Facebook, but will also soon be on Instagram. And so on the Facebook Book Club, we share information. This November, we're going to have an OE online book chat about Difficult Women, which is the second book we're reading this year. We have, for this year, for the 2018 webinar series, we have 3 more webinars in the 2018 year. In October, the date actually is going to change as of today, but there's Basics of Finance and Salary Negotiation with Yulia Dennis. On November 14th, we have a webinar about fostering inclusive and body positive culture for students and staff in higher education. And then on December 4th, we have Gender 101. I also wanted to give a brief plug for the OE conference coming up in February. It is February 1st and 2nd this year, and the conference program, which the OE Education Committee is actually reviewing, will be released on October 1st. So those are some of the OE education initiatives I invite you to participate with. With that, actually, I'm going to let Kara join us and take over the screen.
Thank you so much. So as Cherise said, my name is Kara Sappington, and I'm excited to talk to all of you a bit about the dimensions of culture and influences in higher education today. Just to give you a little bit of my background, I went to Oregon State University, and for a number of years after that worked with children and families in a variety of circumstances, including special needs for behavior and English language programs, and continued my education in intercultural studies and TESOL. And since then have worked a number of years in higher education, both in the US and overseas. And I'll be kind of reflecting on some of my experiences connected with that, and have the privilege to work with TESOL as a representative as well. So as we dive in to the topic of culture and education, I wanted to give us a chance to kind of reflect a little bit personally on some of our perspectives or how we view circumstances. So take a minute just to look at this image and think about what's the first thing that comes to mind that you think is happening in this situation. How many people are there? Who are they? What do you think is kind of happening in this situation? And reflect, how do you think your cultural perspective would influence maybe what you see? So coming back and kind of taking a broader look at the image, you're going to see a number of bullet points that come from Hofstede's research that are all different answers to this exact same image and what people felt like they interpreted seeing happening in the situation. Some people felt like there was 2 women walking and a man threatened one of the women with a piece of wood. Or others felt like there was people gardening, maybe more community involvement, a farm family working hard on their land. Others felt like there was a man digging a hole and a woman was maybe dropping the seed. So as we approach situations, as we interact with people, just recognizing that each of us have different interpretations based on our worldview, our background, and that influences how we sometimes interact and interpret situations. So today we're really just gonna just focus on being aware of some of those, and then from there thinking about maybe what knowledge do we want to gain about ourselves, about other cultures, and what skills can we develop. And just to kind of continue some self-exploration as we kick off, I want you to take a minute to think about assumptions. So we often have assumptions or stereotypes, maybe that we felt like have been against us, or that automatically we kind of have without even thinking about it in situations. So maybe if you have a Post-it next to you, or maybe your phone, think about and write down what is one assumption or a stereotype people think about you. Maybe it's something based on your age, based on your job, based on your gender, your ethnicity, maybe the types of activities you do. What is something that you felt like people assume that may or may not be true? And then on the other side, number 2, write down something that people might not know about you. Maybe it's an experience that you've had, or maybe a certain skill set that maybe they haven't seen in you yet. But something that you know is true about you that you say, hey, I wish more people knew that. Just being aware of these, it kind of, I know personally for me when I think about assumptions, it kind of helps me to take a step back and realize, oh, sometimes I've felt this way, and I know sometimes I've even without recognizing it, made assumptions about students or cultures or peers without necessarily realizing the context that they come from. And with that, diving into what really is culture. There's lots of definitions on culture, and as we go into this, we're definitely going to be just hitting the surface on the idea of culture and cultural dimensions. Hofstede, in his book in 2001, explained that culture consists in patterned ways of thinking, feeling, reacting, acquired and transmitted mainly by symbols, constituting the distinctive achievements of human groups, including their embodiments in artifacts. The essential core culture consists of traditional, historical, and derived and selected ideas, especially their attached values. So we're going to be kind of looking at what does that kind of mean, and how is that maybe lived out in someone's individual life, in their society, and how can that kind of influence our teams, our classrooms, and our university or school campuses. There's a lot of different metaphors or images that are used to try to illustrate the idea of culture. These are just 2 of them that I wanted to take us a minute to just reflect on. The first one is the iceberg. And the top part of the iceberg, it's what you're able to see ahead as you're in your boat. Those are things that are more visible. Things that are maybe easily observed if you're visiting a culture for the first time. Things such as food, etiquette, religion, language, maybe the types of dress, behavior, things that you're able to see within kind of a short period of time of spending time with someone or within a different environment. But you'll notice under the surface, there's a huge part of the iceberg that is really not visible from the surface. These are things that take a lot of time and immersion to really understand and decode. These tend to relate more to core beliefs and values within a culture, assumptions, customs, attitudes, and other things that kind of make up our cultural DNA. On the right-hand side is another illustration that's often used to try to illustrate the complexity of culture, and this is the cultural onion. On the outside layer of the onion, you'd kind of peel off the layers to get to that core. And the part that's on the outside, again, is what's most visible and most obvious usually. So symbols could be things like flags or icons, things that you're able to observe. Heroes, as we go inside, could be both real or fictional heroes, whether they're living or dead. We have rituals, which could relate to ceremonies, significant periods of life, religion, and then in the middle is core values. And these are areas that even, as a child that you don't realize are being kind of instilled in you, things such as good and evil or ugly and beautiful, and just kind of values that you are raised with and kind of continue to foster as you grow and have different experiences. So you'll definitely see that both of these give the impression of just the complexity and the layers of culture. And just keep in mind as well that there will be some just generalizations that are made about culture, but each individual is going to be unique. Today we're going to focus on some of the cultural research that was based off of a multinational corporation, IBM. Geert Hofstede is one of the cultural researcher that created what we call cultural dimensions based on his research. It started in 1967 and went to 1973, and then later he expanded the research with the contribution of others such as Bond and others in 1980. And as we continue to look at these, just think about maybe what cultural dimensions do you see in yourselves and others, and just recognize, again, it's going to be on a scale, and some of the research is not going to apply to everyone within that culture. But our goal today is really just to gain awareness, think about what knowledge we can kind of set as a goal or the next steps, and think about how we can continue to gain cultural and intercultural communication skills to help us to be more effective. Looking a little bit closer at Hofstede's research, which is the foundation of this presentation, most of this data is going to come from his cultural consequences, comparing values, behaviors, institutions, and organizations across nations. The dimensions that we're going to mostly focus on today are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism and collectivism, masculinity and femininity, long-term and short-term orientation. So again, we're definitely just going to hit the surface today and talk about some tips and things to be aware of. Later, indulgence was added as well as a cultural dimension. And as we talk about all of these, the goal is to come back and think about it in a frame of reference of your organization, your team, and specifically looking at higher education. The first dimension that we're going to dive into is power distance. This is one of the top ones that I feel like is discussed a lot in education. And think about it and kind of reflecting on yourself. Do you feel more comfortable when leaders have clear authority and give directions to others? Or do you feel more comfortable when everyone equally shares a voice and participation and is heard? You'll notice on the illustration that high power distance cultures, that there's going to be one individual that typically has a large amount of authority, whether that is an instructor in a classroom to the students, whether that is the administrator to the subordinates, but there's a clear definition of who is in charge and who would be kind of following that lead. On the other side, low power distance is going to have more equality. So there is still a leader or an instructor within that group, but there's more of a purposeful integration and style. And think about, where do you think that the US would fit? Do you think it'd be more focused on low power distance and equality, or high power distance having clear differences? As we look at this scale, countries like the US is typically low power distance, and countries such as Iraq or China or Saudi Arabia would be a higher power distance. So we want to take just a few minutes to think about how could this kind of be potentially impacting our settings. How would this impact team dynamics if there's maybe an individual that's high power distance or low power distance with their cultural background? How would this change the interactions between a subordinate and administrators? How would this impact teacher and parent interactions, or maybe teacher-student interactions? How would a student coming in a high power distance culture struggle if attending a school in the US with less power distance? These are definitely issues that will probably come up at some point on your teams or in your university. I know with some of the classroom settings that I've been a part of, one challenge can be students feeling comfortable about asking questions. So in a high power distance culture, it is very teacher centered. They are the one that have the information, and it can almost be disrespectful for you to ask questions or to question because you're kind of saying, oh, you're not doing your job. And whereas sometimes with a low power distance culture, instructors or team leaders are encouraging people to ask questions and clarify because that shows engagement. And so really thinking about what perspective is your team member or your student coming from, and how can we maybe encourage and explain what our expectations are and what is deemed appropriate in our situation, and encouraged to make sure that they feel most comfortable. So in high power distance cultures, oftentimes individuals may expect there to be a clear leader. They also may function better with really clear tasks at hand. So think about if you're working on a team project within your department, is there someone that really feels like they need to have clear structure? There needs to be one leader. Or those that are comfortable with lower power distance might just feel comfortable that everyone's equal. They want to make sure that everyone has a voice and is able to contribute and to be a part of it. I want to dive a little bit closer at some really specific examples in education on how you might see some of this throughout the year. In a low power distance society where there's a focus more on equality, there's going to be often a focus on two-way communication, whether that's between a student and instructors, or whether that is a supervisor with the subordinate worker. There's an expectation on communication, collaboration, and more of that two-way street. Teachers are definitely still respected and are experts, but are just kind of transferring the information, and as well as kind of their impersonal truths, and really expecting kind of students to also have that critical thinking aspect. Students are put value on independence, so both for having choices, and then instructors often want them to develop skills to be lifelong learners. There is often a more focus on student-centered education and more, again, collaborative kind of environments. On the other side, in a high power distance culture, where there's someone that's in clear authority and then others that would follow, there's a huge focus on the excellence of teachers. Teachers really are the gurus. They have the answer and it should be followed. There's an emphasis on students having conformity and really following what the leader in the classroom or in your business or in your team is communicating. There's a higher chance that in these cultures, top leaders are often typically older, and more of the communication is going to be initiated from the leader. So whether that's the instructor in the classroom to the students, whether that is the president to the staff, there's going to be that clear communication. And I'm sure it's not a surprise, but this model would typically be more teacher-centered. This often means it's more lecture-driven and is a little bit more focused on just sharing the information and students being able to kind of understand and recite that information. So that can, so for those of you that are in classroom settings, that can kind of influence just what they're used to being expected to do as far as class participation, as far as projects and critical thinking, and just being engaged in learning outside of the classroom as well as inside. And this could be applied to within teams, is thinking about how is power centralized versus spread amongst the team. You know, how are teachers kind of perceived, and what does this kind of connect to as we're doing projects? The next cultural dimension that we're going to look at is uncertainty avoidance. And this relates to the tolerance of ambiguity or uncertainty. I definitely feel like, as someone that works a lot with international partners, you need to kind of have a certain sense of ambiguity and just flexibility on working with international students in different cultures. In the US, we rate in kind of the low to medium range, where typically that would be reflected as more relaxed, a little bit more comfortable with risk-taking and some of those types of activities. On the other side, Iraq would be rated a bit higher, and they're a little bit more rule-oriented and want to mitigate or kind of avoid uncertainty if that's something that's possible. So looking at some of these examples for uncertainty avoidance, in low uncertainty avoidance, this is going to be, there's more of an emphasis on really your own ability to be able to accomplish things. Feeling ownership, like you have control over your life and your destiny, and that you're able to you know, kind of choose your path, and your decisions will kind of impact what your future looks like. There's a little bit more comfort with, again, ambiguity, more tolerance of diversity, whether that's ideas, cultures, and there's just a little bit more of a let's take life as it comes and day to day. Some comments communicate that in this type of a culture, there's a little bit more engagement sometimes with parents within the classroom environments. In a high uncertainty avoidance situation, life can be, you can feel a little bit more cautious and an urge to just kind of stay busy. You don't really want to have a lot of unknowns or take risks if you don't have to. And sometimes it can feel like the life is already kind of destined, and you're a little bit more powerless to the external forces of life as you're approaching things. So you, again, kind of think about how could this impact my interactions with students, my interactions with my coworkers. There's definitely some individuals I've worked with that have more of a comfort level than others with ambiguity or diversity or what degree of structure they need. So think about, oh, maybe this someone is more comfortable in high uncertainty avoidance. They really want to have structure. They want to kind of take less risks and kind of know what needs to be done. And versus there's others that are going to kind of thrive in the chaos or kind of the craziness of life and planning for certain events, and think about how you can kind of maybe even assign tasks to individuals based on their natural kind of comfort zone or kind of cultural tendencies as well, so that they can feel thriving and like they're able to really contribute and feel successful in that role. So now it's quiz time. So true or false, based on kind of what you've heard a little bit about uncertainty avoidance. In high uncertainty avoidance contexts, do you think that intellectual disagreement in academic matters is interpreted as a personal dishonesty? So based on Hofstede's book, he would say that is true, that in high uncertainty avoidance, it can be very personal. This can often be because rules are very important within this culture, and it can often be more of a shame-based culture. Number two, when uncertainty avoidance is high, students often enjoy open-ended learning activities with broad assignments and no strict timetable. False. So again, within this type of culture, the students or your coworkers would really thrive with very clear expectations. Clear expectations on the assignments, clear examples on what needs to be done, and clear timetables on when things are due. Everyone's going to interpret time differently, but again, this helps with having less ambiguity, and they know kind of what's expected of them and when things need to be turned in. Number three, students in a high uncertainty avoidance are less likely to attribute their achievements to their own ability than students in a low uncertainty avoidance country. So this one is true. So this can also lead sometimes to kind of collectivist versus individualistic thoughts, but students that are feeling, again, that are more comfortable with diversity, and again, like we talked about, having a belief in their own ability to control their life, are more likely to attribute their achievements to their own efforts and kind of actions. Number four, it is more common to seek active engagement and ideas from parents in weak uncertainty avoidance. So this is true. Sometimes they can be a little bit more collaborative, accepting of more ideas and people. So it's a little bit more common in weak uncertainty avoidance cultures to have more variety of engagement on teams or in collaboration with things. So for those that are more maybe in administration, or even in your teaching role, think about what is the structure of your university or the school that you work with, or even your team. What are the things that you feel valued? How do they kind of configure themselves? How do they usually kind of coordinate? What is a key part of your organization? This illustration is from Hofstede's book and just illustrates some of their research and highlights some of the summaries that they found of different business structures across a few countries. So what are the foundational differences that they found in how organizations are configured across cultures? You'll notice that some of them, like in high certainty, high power distance cultures, again, have more direct supervision, are focused a little bit more on bureaucracy, and that's something that's of high importance. You want to have those clear distinctions and standards. On the low power distance, you're going to have a little bit more collaboration, a focus on staff support, and again, more of a focus on equality. You'll notice there's differences again with the low and the high uncertainty avoidance as well. And the US kind of in the middle, looking at standardization, the middle line, and being able to kind of contribute, having different people contribute and participate in the goals of the organization. So think about what are the values in your organization, and how does that maybe influence how your work is getting done, how your teams are kind of structured, and the ways that you go about getting approval for things. All of this, even within each institutions, we have our own institutional culture. And if you go to a new school, you kind of have to learn that culture again, right? So each one is going to have a different way of kind of operating, their preferences on how they feel they coordinate, and some of the key ways that they operate. So this is kind of helpful to maybe think about at your current institution, maybe places that you've worked before, what is the same and different, and how can you kind of learn from those and continue to improve your role within that organization. This is going to take us to individualism versus collectivism. So individualism is kind of what it sounds like. It's really just focusing on you as the individual. This can be when you're making decisions. It influences, you're really kind of thinking about maybe just your immediate family or yourself when you're approaching situations, when you're applying for a job or thinking about what your career is going to be. You're really kind of in charge of yourself. On the other side, collectivism is really focused on the group as the priority. So whether that's your extended family, maybe your tribe, or even your country, you're focused a lot in making decisions on not just how does this choice affect me, but how does it affect the larger group. And this can be very different perspective coming in from different cultures. Again, as we look at this, countries such as the US are typically going to be more individualistic. And so as we think about individualism, often there's, even as children maybe turn 18 in the US, they're encouraged to get a job and become more independent, maybe move out, go to school and start kind of taking ownership a little bit of their lives. And in some cultures, it's more common for there to be a lot more intergenerational living environment, support across generations, and some of that's going to be a little bit more popular. Again, this is going to just a reminder that these are just generalizations, and even within the US culture, there's going to be a lot of pockets where individuals might fall in different categories on the cultural dimensions. In this chart, it shows highlights of about 50 countries and 3 regions. And you'll see that there's a lot of countries kind of in the pocket that have individualism as well as high power distance as a value within their culture. So some of these countries you're going to highlight are Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Japan. Some of those are going to have more of a value on having a group emphasis. So the group is more important than the individual, and there's a higher emphasis on power distance. So the person that is in authority is going to have this final say and provide leadership to those under them. In the bottom left-hand corner, you're going to see some countries that have a higher index in individualism, and some of those also have smaller power distance. So again, with individualism, there's going to be a little bit more focus on just individual rights and individual kind of decisions on what's best for me and my individual family. And with power distance, you're going to look at, there's a focus more on equality. So how are all people equal? What rights do people have within that area? Some of these countries you'll notice on the chart is New Zealand, Australia, the US, Denmark, and then you'll see some other kind of scattered quadrants as well. But as we look at low individualistic countries, so those are the ones that are more collectivist, they again focus on the we. They focus on extended families, on clans. This is often, there's more traditional societies, and private life sometimes is more invaded by institutions and organizations which they belong to. In high individualistic countries, such as the US, I is more of the focus. We focus on ourselves, our immediate families, and there's more of an emphasis on individual achievement. Self-started activities are encouraged, and people often want the right to their private life. So think about how would this impact maybe making decisions? I know for myself, I've been on teams where we're developing partnerships with different organizations or different individuals in various countries overseas. We might assume that that person is able to make decisions and make commitments, but maybe they come from more of a collectivist society and collectivist team where they really need to discuss this, what's best for the whole group, and maybe that's something that they're needing to be able to get approval from their supervisor. In making decisions, we could also think about a student perspective. As an advisor, your student is going to be making decisions differently if they're thinking about we and the collectivists of their unit, or if they're just thinking about their personal life. One way I've seen this is by students having the difficulty in choosing a major. I've had a number of students in my English language classes that say, I must get an engineering degree, but they're not strong in math and they're not strong in some of the critical thinking aspects, but that's kind of what their family felt like they should get. And so it's definitely the student needs to look at all the dynamics. What is their gifting? What is best for their family? What's best for their kind of country or whatever it is that they're going back to? And all of those influence their decisions on choosing a major. For me, as just kind of a traditional American family, I had a lot of freedom in my choice on what I was wanting to do for my degree, and my parents were very supportive of that. But I felt like I had a lot of freedom and was really not thinking about my extended family or my city in making that decision. So it can just really change your perspective on what's influencing someone and what their cultural background is kind of causing them to, how that's causing them to make certain decisions or view situations differently. So again, just being aware of it, thinking about what knowledge you want to gain about some of these areas and skills. Just a few more examples. I know for me, I've personally had this example when I taught in Northern Iraq at a university. That would again be more of a collectivist society where peers and groups are very important versus the US, which is more individualistic. And the students knew that academic honesty was something that we were training, and everyone needed to do their own work. And one individual student that I had, one of her peers had asked her, did you do homework? Because she hadn't got it done and wanted to copy. And my student lied to her and said, no, I forgot to do my homework too, I don't have it. And she snuck in my classroom during break and said, you know, Miss Sappington, I have my homework, but can I give it to you early? Because my friend wanted to copy and I knew it would be wrong to give it to her, but I can't tell her no because it would be shame for our families. And so she wanted to give me her homework early. So just thinking about the perspectives and the pressures that can come alongside with cultural expectations can impact your teams and impact your classrooms without you even realizing it. Another example in more collectivist societies is thinking about just kind of the relationships even with performance. So in more collectivist societies, incentives are often given to the larger group, not just one person. Versus high individualistic societies, there's often direct appraisal of performance to improve productivity. And this can be an important reflection to think about within your university. What does your performance review system look like? And how is that maybe perceived by individuals within your team? Are they comfortable being individually kind of critiqued and evaluated by their individual contributions? Or are they expecting to be evaluated as a whole department and team? Also within the classroom, what are students' expectations on feedback and grades and incentive and motivation? So being aware of what are their cultural backgrounds and perspectives, and how can we maybe just kind of learn to communicate and be aware of these things. Often in more collectivist society, the purpose of education is really to learn how to do things. So we want to teach the person how to fish, not just give them a fish, right? We want to instill someone to have that self-motivation to learn and to be able to do things. And diplomas definitely help to provide self-respect and economic opportunities. In the collectivist society, it's really just how to do things. Education and diplomas and certificates are held in very high status, but sometimes it's not necessarily as focused on how to learn, but kind of just what you need to do to get something done. The next one that we're going to look at is masculinity. So in thinking about masculinity and femininity, we obviously talk about this a lot related to gender. And in the cultural research, it definitely can relate to that, but it's a little bit more. Masculinity relates to often ambition, wealth, differentiated roles, and gender. And feminine qualities often are a little bit more relational oriented, flexible, tender. There's a little bit more flexibility in the family structure within that type of model. So think about what are the values within your organization and within your team? Is there more of a value on relationships? Is there more of a value on task and ambition? Is there a focus on kind of success? Is there a focus on being kind of more tender and kind of caring? What are the focuses that kind of implicitly kind of come through the interactions with others? What about in your classroom? A few examples from Hofstede's illustration. Japan is very masculine and has high power distance. So in this type of culture, again, kind of success, wealth is going to be respected, and also whoever is in the highest status is going to be looked at and respected in that power, and others would kind of follow that direction. In Korea, based on this research, you're going to notice that they're a little bit more feminine, so a little bit more relation-oriented, a little bit more kind of flexible on the roles, but they are going to have high power distance as well. So there's going to be a clear kind of defining line between who would be the superior and the subordinates within the teaching or within the business context. In Sweden, it's a little bit more feminine based on the research and has a low power distance culture. So focused more on equality, on tenderness, on relationships, and flexibility within family structure. So in a low masculinity or more feminine environment, students' social adaptation is very important and focused on. Curriculum choices are guided often by intrinsic interest. Boys and girls may take the same subjects. There's a lot of flexibility on both the study and education as well as family concepts, and there's a smaller gender gap. Again, in this area, there's also just more of a job equality and education opportunity focused, depending, no matter what the gender is. In high masculinity contexts, oftentimes student performance is very focused on. Sometimes it can be a little bit more assessment driven. And curriculum choices can often be more guided by career expectations. And sometimes this can mean boys and girls would study different subjects or maybe even be in different classrooms. Traditional family concepts are typically a little bit more expected, where maybe the male is the breadwinner and the one that's working, and the female is the one that would be taking care of the home and the children. Within this type of culture, there's going to be a larger culture gap, and typically you'll find a little bit less equality within some of these areas as far as education access and kind of jobs within that. So think about when on a mixed gender team, can it be assumed that guys would take the task that would be more aggressive than a woman that would take that project? Who would be the best fit for that role? And are there assumptions that we're making when we're coming together as a team? The next one that we want to look at, and this will be our final one before we start kind of making some applications and have some time for question and answer, is long-term orientation. So long-term is really what it sounds like. It's more focused on being comfortable focusing on the future and long-term goals. Short-term orientation is focused more on the present as well as the past, are both considered more important than the future. When thinking about it, with low or kind of short term, quick results are often expected. In business, short-term results are really the bottom line. You want to have that instant gratification. You want to be able to see progress and track. Leisure time is often more important just because, again, you're kind of focused more on what's happening right now in the moment. And there's a higher focus on tradition and preservance of faith because, again, the past is highly respected. So you'll often see traditions being passed down from generation to generation is something that's very important within that type of culture. One that's more focused on high long-term orientation has more of an emphasis on perseverance and really doing things now that will pay off later. So in business, there's more of a focus on relationships, on market position, delaying maybe gratification, for the needs based on how that could potentially impact the future. Fostering of virtues, forward time thinking, again, kind of being thrifty, having perseverance, and continuing to kind of push towards goals. So think about how you maybe set up kind of your goals within your classroom and even the long-term goals of students that you work with. Are they thinking about just kind of the here and now? Are they thinking about what they're doing after graduation? And how is that maybe impacting their motivation? And how is that impacting maybe their perseverance or how they perceive the value of experiencing life now versus what the benefit will be after graduation? And in the context of a team, think about what are the long-term goals of your school or department. Are those things that you have established? Do you have both short-term and long-term goals? And how are those maybe emphasized within your department? Being able to kind of understand those and think about your natural tendencies as well, and being aware of those around you can help us to be a little bit more effective in our teams. And this leads us to really leadership and empowerment, which is such a huge part of Oregon Women of Higher Education. And thinking about in all of these kind of cultural dimensions that we've talked about related to power distance and individualism versus collectivism, think about like what are the leadership qualities or the team qualities that you tend to prefer. In Hofstede's books, it says, ideas about leadership reflect the dominant culture of a country. Asking people to describe the qualities of a good leader is in fact another way of asking them to describe their culture. So the values that you see in a leader often reflect what you value as a culture. So think about what are the qualities of a good leader in your opinion? You could add a comment if you want in the box. So what are the qualities of a good leader? What makes a good teacher? Is it someone that just gives information and it's accurate and you're able to kind of recite that information? Or is it someone that's teaching you to really do the research on your own and come to your own conclusions and be able to do more information with that later? So our values on how we perceive leaders, on how we perceive teachers, has cultural influences. Think about what organizational model fits your institution and your team. how does culture really influence all of those elements? So think about some of the examples from the book is that close supervisions have been very positive in improving workers more so than the US. Higher authoritarian leadership improved productivity in some of the Indian children that they did kind of observations on. Modest leaders were valued in feminine cultures such as the Dutch. So each cultural influence is going to change and kind of impact how we're kind of interpreting teams, how we're interpreting the value. And really, there's no uniform formula. Whether it's your cultural background or those you're interacting with others, it's not black and white, and the goal is just to continue to think about how can I be aware of my own assumptions and my own culture. How can I be more aware of others and continue to gain knowledge about culture and skills and working in more diverse settings. There's lots of ways that we can continue to grow as individual leaders and think about how we can apply some of these to our specific settings. In some collectivist societies, feedback is better given sometimes indirectly, maybe through someone that's older. So think about how you're applying or structuring this. If you're in that type of a society or you're needing to do formal evaluations, how would you structure indirect feedback versus direct feedback, whether that's in a classroom or on a team? How does some of this maybe influence your organization, your classroom, or your team? This is just an example to show some of the variety that you're going to see in some of the countries. I just chose 4 that I've had a lot in our university classrooms. So the blue, you're going to see China, and the purple is Iraq, the green, Saudi Arabia, and the orange is the United States. And this shows some of the cultural dimensions that we've been talking about today. This graph was created just with Hofstede's Insights website, where you can compare up to 4 countries. And then I'm also going to show you an application that you can even download on your phone for tips. That focuses more on business environment, but can definitely be applied to working with teams at university level or even with students in a classroom. But even just by glancing, you'll notice that there's going to be certain dimensions that there's more drastically a contrast than others. And so just recognizing that, I might approach the situation differently because I'm assuming that coming from a low power distance culture where I want everyone to be heard and equality is important, that I'm assuming that everyone within my planning team is coming from that same perspective. Whereas another individual that might be coming from a high power distance culture might be expecting there to just be one leader, and they're the ones that are making the final decision. And it's not necessarily essential that everyone has an equal voice within that meeting. So being able to just recognize some of the trends that you're going to see kind of across different cultures and the values can be really interesting, and just opening your eyes to the different perspectives that someone might be approaching a situation with. I really just want to empower you to really think about how can you be more aware of yourself, how can you be more aware of other cultures, other diverse individuals that you're working with around in the community or at your campus. How can you challenge yourself to maybe gain new knowledge about culture, and what skills do you want to maybe make a priority to really hone in on over the next year? There's lots of ways to be able to kind of grow your own cultural knowledge and continue to look for opportunities. There's continuing education here through the webinars. There's cultural intelligence workshops that can last, one day to a weekend that are held in the area, and other great resources. Some of the examples that we looked at today are from the books Cultural Intelligence, cultural intelligence on cultural consequences, comparing values, behaviors, institutions, and organizations across nations, as well as a great book if you're doing kind of team dynamics or maybe icebreakers, is Exploring Culture, Exercises, Stories, and Synthetic Cultures. So both of those are books that are available. Also, if you have a smartphone, there's a cultural app that you can download as well that's based on Geert Hofstede's research. So you're able to kind of look up and compare cultures, and also click on, when you're comparing cultures, it'll give you advice on if you're interacting with a culture that's different from yours based on that category, what are some tips? And that's called Cultural GPS, and is just another great resource. This is a screenshot of what it can look like as you get into the application. So you can set some country preferences, start comparisons, and look at recommendations on tips to interacting with different cultures as well. I just want to thank you so much for taking time to just open your mind a little bit to different dimensions of culture related on Hofstede's research, and think about how could you possibly apply this to your classroom, to your higher education teams, and to your institution and other interactions as a whole. I want to just challenge you to continue to be more aware, continue to gain knowledge and skills that will continue to just influence your ability to be a more powerfully diverse worker, and increase your comfort level in working with those from other cultures. So I know Charisse was going to look to see if there's any questions at the end today, if you have any.
Thanks, Cara. So this is Charisse again. So I have a couple questions too, and people please feel free to type in questions into the chat box and we'll get Cara to answer them. So my first question is, so with, like, this takes, a lot of Hofstede's research is directly related to like international, international identity, or where people are coming from, I guess. But what is there any research in there, or what has been your experience of the, I guess, culture clash between first-gen students here in the first or second-gen students that may have originated in some other countries, and then their interactions with folks that are coming as non-immigrant students to the U.S. So,
Yes.
like, I think in particular here at the University of Oregon, like, there's a Vietnamese Student Association that's dominated by Vietnamese American students who have never been to Vietnam. And there's a very large clash there. And some of these generalizations, some of Hofstede's research actually doesn't apply to those students' identities. So, like, what has been your experience with that? And what do you think are some lessons or thoughts we can take about that, sort of the dynamics between those two populations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, well, I think there's so many layers to it as well. When thinking about having students that are kind of from diverse cultures on your campuses or on our administrations and teaching teams, again, just think one thing that I try to do is just, again, not make assumptions that were they raised in a different country, what are their beliefs and cultural practices, and just kind of trying to kind of get to know, but just kind of be aware that maybe there are some differences, but not maybe assuming that this is going to be true because that's maybe like their ethnicity background. And I think too, with first generation students, not with some students, just depending on how they were raised, whether they still have a lot of cultural traditions within their home. A lot of them, I think, end up being kind of these hybrid where there's definitely certain characteristics that they have, kind of these typical, what we talk about as like American values, because they were just raised within a US culture. But then there's other influences that might come up, such as, like, I have a friend that grew up Native American, and she has a lot of her cultural characteristics would probably be very similar to kind of typical American style, but then there's other things that would be influenced by her Hispanic and her Native American heritage, such as kind of some of the emphasis more on family orientation and collectivism was a little bit more of a priority than just herself. So you get kind of this a mix on recognizing that each person is really going to look different. I know personally, I've gone through cultural intelligence seminar where you take a large survey and actually get like a full booklet report on yourself, which I think can just be a good personal reflection as well. And I know there was, even for me as an individual, I was surprised on where I was on the scale versus maybe where they would say a classic American would be. So I think that's really important, Therese, to think about is recognizing that all students are going to be different, especially students that have lived in maybe multiple cultures. And that's going to be the reverse too. If there's an American that has been raised internationally, their culture is going to look different as well than a traditional American student.
Thank you. So my second question, and people, please feel free to write questions, and if you have any. So you talked about like feminine and masculine, and loosely tied to gender. So what is there research within Hofstede's work about beyond the binary, so that, you know, gender and gender is much more complicated, and looking at how that happens? I think that there tends to be, you know, here in higher education, at least at the University of Oregon, I can speak of, students come and all students do, you know, speak about pronouns, and but international students, for example, have never actually talked about pronouns. And when we introduce that, it ends up leading into a lot of conversations that actually, in many cases, may have never happened before.
Yeah.
Even in one case where I worked with a student who'd been here for high school, and he was already a senior at the U of O and had never actually had that discussion. And so that student is, first of all, not a part of the conversation happening about the complexity of gender. But yeah, what has been your experience with that? What have you read, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's such a been such a growing kind of conversation topic that some of this research is kind of still catching up, I feel like, to some of those conversations related to gender and the complexity around some of those topics. So I think there's definitely more research that will be coming forward kind of around some of those areas. I have had that experience as well with English language learners, or even just when you look at curriculum in a textbook on, you know, how is gender used? I think a lot of us don't really even recognize without looking at it, you know, sometimes how certain in curriculum, how certain genders are maybe displayed within the curriculum, or like what pronouns are being used as references. I think a lot of times we don't really recognize kind of what message that potentially is sending or not. So I know that there's a few people at University of Oregon and others that have been kind of researching a little bit in that topic and are really passionate about that. But yeah, it is interesting that there's some cultures that don't really have references, you know, to some of those, and so to come and there's all these different kind of comparisons in the language on how they're needing to define things can be definitely open up some different conversations. And I think as far as the cultural differences, I think with related to gender, I think more of that research will be coming. But I personally have not seen a lot of that yet.
All right. Thank you so much, Cara. Did you have any final words you wanted to share? It looks like nobody added any more questions.
No, I think that is great. Yeah, I just want to encourage you definitely to check out some of the applications and just kind of be proactive about, again, not making assumptions, but thinking about just kind of even being self-aware on, am I automatically having certain thoughts based on someone's diversity, or kind of what based on their age or race or gender or kind of role, just kind of being more aware of what are your thoughts and what could potential differences or similarities be with the people that you're interacting with, and just really being proactive about developing relationships and just continuing to learn more about others and about culture, I think is so valuable for all of us. So I thank you for the chance just for me to share a little bit about what I've been learning and some of the ways that I've been challenged in higher education, both in the US as well as in Iraq as well.
Thanks, Cara. There's actually one more question real fast she put in here. So do you have some suggestions to affirm collectivist learners sitting in individualistic classrooms in assessment-driven academic culture?
Yeah, for a student that is more collectivist but is wanting that is an individualistic culture, I think that there's a few things. One thing that sometimes I'll do is, whether it's not maybe looking at like what are the types of assessment that we're doing as well, and what are opportunities that we have within the classroom. And so even like within kind of a lecture time, even just really basic things as far as taking a minute to, when I'm lecturing, rather than just asking the question and expecting a response, giving time for learners, whether they're collectivist learners or kind of English language background or just regular students, to kind of take a minute to think about their answer and kind of share collaboratively, like with their partners next to them. Kind of having those times to kind of share ideas, I think, can be a really small way to kind of help them feel a little bit more comfortable than being able to just kind of forcing them to give their answer just on their own. But giving a minute to kind of do that think, pair, share kind of activity, I think, can be a really simple step. And just thinking about kind of within assessments, sometimes I have done group project assessments, which can always be tricky as far as, grading goes. Sometimes I've seen instructors do it where the group projects are maybe just kind of for practice, for a larger assessment that will kind of be on their own, but it gives them a chance to collaborate with other students and to really kind of practice before they're being forced to kind of do something independently that's a larger grade as well. So I think there's a few ways to really still encourage students that each of their voices are heard and that they're able to collaborate. But I think also, just being in an American university, it's also important just to be really explicit on, are there things that are okay to collaborate and not collaborate on, especially when it comes to kind of academic honesty issues, because I think that can be a really gray area for students that just assume that it's okay to be able to work with a partner. So I think providing opportunities for collaboration and interacting with others is definitely appropriate, and just being really proactive on what is okay to collaborate and what are you expecting students to do on their own, I think is appropriate in an American classroom. But that's definitely a struggle to help students from group and collectivist societies feel more important. And I also like to look for opportunities for them to even kind of maybe tell their story and make connections on how maybe what they're doing is helping their family or their tribe, and kind of making those connections. I think on knowing why am I doing this now, and how is that going to kind of help me with my goals in the future, has helped me at certain points with motivation issues with some of those students.
Thank you so much, Cara.
Yeah, definitely.
And we will be, with that, we're a little bit over the 1 o'clock time. So with that, I'm actually going to end the webinar. Thank you all for participating. Thanks, Cara, for giving your time to us. And this will be available on our YouTube channel, and I will send out information and resources to everybody who registered. Thank you so much.
Thank you.